Hi, my name is Catherine, and welcome to my channel where we talk about books you should read instead of stuff you should buy. Today, I want to talk about the book that inspired this channel, Less is More: How Degrowth Will Save the World by Jason Hickel. I first read this book a few years ago, and in preparation for this video, I read it again. I gave it 10 stars because it was a 5-star read then and a 5-star read now. As I said on Storygraph, I'm considering buying 100 copies and knocking on doors. This book is an absolute must-read because the topic of degrowth is a major blind spot for a lot of progressives and progressive political commentators, even ones who identify as leftists. They acknowledge the injustices of imperialism, but they fail to make the connection that any economic model that demands growth is inherently imperialistic. They acknowledge the threat of climate change, but either do not understand or do not convey to their audience that degrowth is imperative to addressing climate change. Many won't touch the idea because it's deemed political suicide. Any politician advocating for degrowth surely won't win. But Jason Hickel is admittedly an academic, not a political strategist, and he acknowledges that academic terms can carry political baggage. He agrees that political candidates should probably avoid using the term degrowth in their campaigning. Frame it how you see fit, but the concept of degrowth must be embraced because we don't have any other choice. In order to prevent climate collapse, we must abandon the pursuit of economic growth, and the consumption levels of wealthy nations must be reduced. And this book is a great introduction to the topic because it is written in an accessible way that is both concise and fairly comprehensive. Part 1, titled More is Less, details the history of capitalism and how the pursuit of growth has caused many of the problems we see today, most notably climate change. He debunks the concept of green growth, which is based on techno-optimism and the delusion that we can somehow decouple GDP from material resource use. Part 2, titled Less is More, lists solutions and the many ways in which our lives would improve in a post-growth economy. So to answer the question, what is degrowth, I'll be drawing a lot from the book, but then I want to talk about how I've implemented the principles of degrowth in my own life. To understand degrowth, we first have to understand why capitalism requires infinite growth. Capitalism is often defined in terms like markets and money, but it's important to note that these things existed long before capitalism, and they are not the problem. What defines capitalism is capital, which is not money itself, but the total value of the inputs that are used to generate wealth, specifically in the hands of private owners rather than the public. Capital, Hickel says, behaves a bit like a virus. A virus is a piece of genetic code that is programmed to replicate itself, but cannot do so on its own. It has to infect a host cell and force that cell to create copies of its DNA, and then each of those copies goes on to infect other cells in order to create more copies, and so on. The sole purpose of a virus is self-replication. Whatever the economic system, capital is coded to grow, but the conditions of capitalism necessitates that growth, whereas the conditions of socialism do not. To extend Hickel's metaphor a bit, if capital behaves like a virus, democratic control acts as a vaccine. When capital is publicly owned, there is a strong incentive to put caps on growth because the problems that arise from excess growth are shared collectively. But when capital is privately owned, these problems are externalized to the working class. The elite use their wealth to evade the brunt of the consequences. Along with there being little incentive to limit growth aside from altruism, there are strong pressures to grow in such a system because the system primarily operates on credit. Quote, "When you walk into a bank to take out a loan, you might assume that the bank is lending you money it has in its reserve, collected from other people's deposits, and stored in a basement vault somewhere. But that's not how it works. Banks are only required to hold reserves worth about 10% of the money they lend out, or even less. This is known as fractional reserve banking. In other words, banks lend out about 10 times more money than they actually have. So where does that extra money come from if it doesn't actually exist? Banks create it out of thin air when they credit your account. They literally loan it into existence. More than 90% of the money that's presently circulating in our economy is created in this manner. In other words, almost every single dollar that passes through our hands represents somebody's debt, and this debt has to be paid back with interest, with more work, more extraction, and more production. But let's say you've grown your business to the point where your debt is paid off. What then? Of course you can point to examples of small businesses that operate in a steady state, meaning they're profitable, but their rate of profit does not grow. These businesses often serve a niche market that is yet to attract competition, but their existence is precarious, because if you fail to grow, you risk being driven out of business by competitors. And any venture-backed startup or publicly traded corporation simply cannot exist in a steady state. They must grow or else they will die. Because when investors assess the health of a company, they look at the rate of growth. If there's no growth, they pull out. It goes without saying that we cannot continue to grow the economy by extracting and burning ever more fossil fuels. This video is not meant to persuade those who champion fossil fuels and deny climate change outright. But there are different forms of climate change denial, and more insidious than outright denial is this idea of green growth. While masquerading as a solution to climate change, it enables us to kick the can down the road and avoid addressing the real threat. Fossil fuels are a major problem, yes, but the underlying problem is capitalism. In a hypothetical world without fossil fuels, a capitalist system that necessitates perpetual growth would still create an ecological crisis, though it would look different. Advocates of green growth acknowledge that to prevent ecological collapse, we need to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, 2 degrees max, which means globally we need to reach net zero by 2050. But what they fail to acknowledge is that it's impossible to shift to 100% renewable energy and simultaneously grow the economy in such a narrow timeframe. Currently, our energy demands are increasing faster than our capacity to roll out renewables. Clean energy isn't replacing dirty energy, it's being added on top of it. But regardless of this time constraint, viewing the problem as simply a matter of emissions rather than extraction is misguided. Ecological breakdown is not occurring solely because of greenhouse gas emissions. It's also being driven by deforestation, mining, overfishing, etc. Solar panels, wind turbines, and nuclear power plants all require the extraction of resources, metals, and rare earth minerals. The overall impact is less compared to fossil fuels, but which is worse? Burning fossil fuels to power an economy 1/10 of our current size? Or using renewable energy to power an economy 100 times its size? The point is, there are limits to growth. Operating under the growth imperative, there's no reason green energy companies won't become as savage and destructive as fossil fuel companies, trashing ecosystems, lobbying against environmental regulations, buying off politicians, etc. And if green energy is being used to power endless extraction and production, can you really call it green? In response to this, green growthers argue that we can decouple economic growth from material resource use, and point to data showing that this has already begun to happen in wealthy countries. However, this data measures domestic material consumption, which, according to Hickel, ignores a crucial piece of the puzzle. While it includes the imported goods a country consumes, it does not include the resources involved in producing those goods. Because rich countries have outsourced so much of their production to other countries, mostly in the global south, that side of resource use has been conveniently shifted off their balance sheet. To account for this, scientists prefer to use a measure called material footprint, which includes the total resources embodied in a nation's imports. Using this more holistic measure, it quickly becomes clear that the material consumption of rich nations hasn't been falling at all. In fact, in recent decades, it's been increasing dramatically, even to the point of outpacing GDP growth. There has been no decoupling. It was all an illusion of accounting. And claims that decoupling is possible are dubious. Switching from a material-based economy to a service-based economy won't lead to decoupling, because services still require material inputs. Tourism, for example, is one of the most resource-intensive activities, despite being classified as a service. Expanding our recycling infrastructure won't lead to decoupling, because most of our resource consumption is stuff that cannot be recycled, like food and air conditioning. And unfortunately, much of the material we think is recyclable cannot actually be recycled. By tossing it in the recycling bin in hopes of it being recycled, you are contaminating sorting machines and disrupting the recycling process. This is known as wish cycling. Stop doing this. And plastic that gets recycled is technically downcycled, meaning the quality breaks down during the recycling process. We should improve our recycling systems, but there's a reason it comes last in reduce, reuse, recycle. Taking this slogan seriously demands degrowth. Green technology won't lead to decoupling because throughout the entire history of capitalism, efficiency gains from technological advancements have enabled capitalists to expand production. Rather than produce the same amount of stuff in less time, workers were ordered to produce more stuff in the same amount of time. Hickel has an entire chapter dedicated to why technology won't save us, and the geoengineering schemes that green growthers are accounting for are truly terrifying. Socialists are often accused of pie-in-the-sky utopian thinking, but this is pure projection. Proponents of capitalism are the ones engaged in magical thinking. Degrowth is feasible. Green growth is a fantasy. Quote, "If we're willing to imagine speculative sci-fi fairy tales to keep the existing economy chugging along, why not just imagine a different kind of economy altogether?" Moving on, let's dispel some of the misconceptions about degrowth. For one, it has nothing to do with overpopulation. Of course, there are limits to population growth, just as there are limits to economic growth. But research shows that populations naturally stabilize with universal access to birth control and education. And as Hickel points out, stabilizing the global population would not cause ecological damage to automatically level off. In the absence of more consumers, capital finds a way to get existing consumers to consume more. Indeed, that has been the dominant story for the past 100 years. The growth rate of material use has always significantly outstripped the growth rate of the population. Critics often conflate degrowth with austerity and claim that it would lead to a global recession. But this misses the point entirely. In the context of our current capitalist economy, halting growth and scaling back production would in fact plunge us into a recession, causing mass suffering. However, in the context of an alternative economic system that is not dictated by the growth imperative, we would not be subject to the same fate. Other critics argue that degrowthers romanticize asceticism and want to force everyone else to live a monastic lifestyle. But this assumes that degrowth requires sacrifice. While this may be true for the wealthy, for everyone else, quality of life would improve. According to Hickel, it would take approximately $10 trillion to eliminate poverty, provide adequate healthcare for everyone, and close the global life expectancy gap. This is about half of the annual income of the richest 1%. If we were to redistribute $10 trillion from the top 1%, they would be left with an average household income of more than $250,000. Let's say we redistribute wealth even further and put a cap on income at $250,000. This would allow far more households to enjoy a middle-class income. Radical, I know. But if you think being cut off at $250,000 is being forced to live like a monk, you are delusional. Degrowth means lower aggregate income, but in a post-growth economy where work hours are reduced, healthcare is provided, and housing costs aren't artificially high, your income would go a lot further. Another misconception is that degrowthers are trying to sabotage economic gains and sacrifice the well-being of those in the global south for the sake of the environment. But degrowth does not mean degrowth of everything, everywhere. Some sectors like clean energy and public transportation need to grow. Obviously, developing countries need to grow their economies to reach a humane standard of living. This argument is disingenuous because fundamentally the degrowth movement is about climate justice. The capital that fueled the Industrial Revolution in Europe and later the United States didn't just manifest out of nowhere. It was stolen from the working class, and most egregiously from the global south. Since the dawn of capitalism, private wealth has come at the expense of public wealth. This was first observed by James Maitland and came to be known as the Lauderdale paradox. In order to grow private wealth, capitalists must immiserate an underclass by creating conditions of artificial scarcity. Resources that are abundant are made artificially scarce by restricting people's access to them by force. This began as the enclosure movement in Europe, which was the systematic destruction of subsistence economies and the privatization of the commons. But eventually, natural resources were depleted, and European peasants revolted and secured basic labor rights for themselves. In response, capitalists sought new frontiers for extraction and exploitation. Thus began the process of colonization. To quote Hickel, "When Europeans began to colonize the Americas, they were not driven by the romance of exploration and discovery, as our schoolbooks would have it. In the spirit of their predecessors, the colonized fought for their independence and eventually won. Thus began the process of neocolonialism, aka structural adjustment. More on that in a future video. Each time capitalists run into a barrier to growth, whether it be resource depletion or a progressive political wins, they seek a fix. Fast fashion companies, for example, have outsourced their manufacturing to poor countries such as Indonesia and Bangladesh because they have very loose or non-existent labor and environmental protections. When you consider material footprint rather than GDP, the data is clear that wealthy countries are responsible for the lion's share of greenhouse gas emissions, and climate change disproportionately affects the global south due to geographical happenstance. The southern hemisphere is more prone to extreme weather conditions, but most notably, financial vulnerability. Poor countries are less equipped to deal with the consequences. Hickel makes the salient point that the South has suffered twice over, first from the appropriation of resources and labor that fueled the North's industrial rise, and now from the appropriation of atmospheric commons by the North's industrial emissions. Using the one planet metric, as I've discussed numerous times on this channel, low-income countries are consuming at a rate below the one planet threshold, meaning if everyone on the planet lived as the average Indian does, we would need less than one Earth. Meanwhile, high-income countries have consumed well beyond their fair share. If everyone lived as the average American does, we would need 5 Earths. This means that the global north is indebted to the global south, despite the books showing the opposite. Again, more on that in a future video. Proponents of capitalism have long argued that inequality is not the issue, poverty is the issue, and that a rising tide lifts all boats. In other words, economic growth is a substitute for equality. But as Hickel argues, if growth is a substitute for equality, then equality can be a substitute for growth. We live on an abundant planet. If we can find ways to share what we already have more fairly, we won't need to plunder the earth for more. Justice is the antidote to growth. He goes on to say, we take it as an article of faith that growth benefits humanity as a whole, that it's essential to human progress. Those who insist that aggregate growth is necessary to improve people's lives force us into a horrible double bind. We are made to choose between human welfare or ecological stability, an impossible choice that nobody wants to face. But when we understand how inequality works, suddenly the choice becomes much easier, between living in a more equitable society on the one hand, and risking ecological catastrophe on the other. Most people would have little difficulty choosing. GDP growth is beneficial when it corresponds with use value, or actual utility. This was the case during the New Deal era in the United States, as well as with low-income countries today. But when GDP growth corresponds with exchange value, or market value, as it does in high-income countries today, it serves the frivolous interests of an elite minority. It's important to understand what GDP actually measures. Though capitalists often use GDP as a measure of human progress, it was never intended to measure human progress. The economist who first introduced GDP warned against using it as such, saying, "The welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measure of national income. Goals for more growth should specify more growth of what and for what." GDP tallies up all monetized economic activity, good or bad. War and environmental destruction increase GDP, yet unpaid labor such as cooking, cleaning, gardening, and childcare are not accounted for, unless of course you pay someone else for these services. GDP correlates with well-being up to a certain point, beyond which the social and ecological costs of growth cancel out the gains. And data shows that it's possible to achieve high levels of human welfare without high levels of GDP. GDP measures the welfare of capitalism, not humans. So let's talk about what actually increases human welfare. For one, having your basic needs met is crucial. Everyone deserves adequate healthcare, housing, education, and transportation. And we don't need to grow the economy to provide these things. We can do this via wealth redistribution. Beyond basic needs, the greatest common denominator in what makes people happy is the freedom to choose what to do with your time. And as I discussed in this video, money buys you this freedom. But what if we could have that freedom without having to pay for it? What if we were given back what was rightfully ours to begin with? Remember, the efficiency gains from technological advancements were stolen from us by capitalists and used to increase production rather than leisure time. Instead of making our lives easier, technology has primarily made rich assholes richer. Shortening the work week delivers multiple benefits to society: greater life satisfaction, reduced unemployment, and a lower environmental footprint. Because it turns out when people have more time off, they gravitate towards lower impact activities such as exercising, volunteering, and socializing. With little time off, people engage in energy-intensive behaviors such as retail therapy, high-speed travel, takeout, and meal delivery services. Unnecessarily long work hours leave people with little time to do things like cook, clean, and look after their kids. This means those with low incomes are in a constant state of burnout, often consuming inadequate meals and living in substandard conditions. Those with higher incomes resort to paying others to do these things for them. If you're someone who hates cooking and cleaning, it might just be that you hate that you have to do these things when you want to be relaxing. I personally enjoy cooking and cleaning when I'm not pressed for time. The same is true for exercise. You need an extraordinary amount of discipline to get and stay fit when you're chronically exhausted from all of the housework on top of your traditional work. A shorter work week reveals that our scarcity of time is mostly artificial. In fact, throughout most of human history, quoting the book, work followed a rhythm that, from the perspective of industrialists, appeared to be irregular and undisciplined. It depended on weather and seasons, on festivals and feast days. Life was organized around the principles of sufficiency and desire. People would work as much as they needed, and the rest of the time they spent dancing, telling stories, and having fun. The Protestant work ethic, which attached productivity to worth, was instilled in people as a means of exploitation and control. Idleness was demonized as a moral failing and even outlawed in some cases. In 1531, England's King Henry VIII passed the first Vagabonds Act, describing idleness as the mother and root of all vices, and ordering that vagabonds should be bound, whipped, and forced to put themselves to labor. These laws unleashed an extraordinary outpouring of state violence against the dispossessed. In England, as many as 72,000 idle persons were hanged during the reign of Henry VIII, according to one account. In the 1570s, up to 400 rogues were executed each year. The goal was to fundamentally change people's beliefs about labor. Elites had to literally whip people into becoming docile, obedient, productive workers. It is unhealthy to work as much as we do today, especially when we account for unpaid labor such as housework. Only the privileged few have the opportunity to set their own schedule, yet many people in such positions choose to work more than necessary because consumerism and workaholism have been culturally ingrained in them. Other degrowth policies that Hickel proposes, such as banning planned obsolescence, restricting advertising, and expanding libraries, would also improve human welfare. Planned obsolescence, which is the practice of intentionally designing products that don't last very long and need to be replaced rather than repaired, is a prime example of capitalism being inefficient rather than efficient, as it's often touted to be. Aside from the benefits of living in a cleaner environment, banning this practice would give us higher quality products and save us the headache of having to constantly replace things. Restricting advertising by banning billboards and outdoor ads entirely, as some cities have, would increase well-being by making environments less cluttered and overwhelming and more visually appealing, but also by eliminating the subconscious messaging that your life is incomplete without XYZ product. Expanding library systems to include tools, kitchen gadgets, camping gear, sewing machines, recording equipment, etc. would reduce clutter in our homes and allow us to save a lot more of our money. My only critique of this book is that the last chapter kind of leans a bit into nature worship. Nature is beautiful and incredible, of course, but nature is also cruel and indifferent, and implying that what is natural is therefore good is a logical fallacy. He speaks quite a bit about animism, the belief that all things, animals, plants, rocks, rivers, and mountains, have a spirit or soul. Plant and ecosystem intelligence is fascinating stuff, but I think it's important to distinguish sentience from intelligence. The reason we care about nature, rivers, mountains, and trees is because the health of these systems impacts sentient beings. This is something I'd love to dig into with Jason Hickel if I ever get the chance to talk to him. The dream. Lastly, I want to talk about the ways I've implemented the principles of degrowth in my own life. As I've discussed in previous videos, we obviously need systemic change, but that doesn't mean individual choices don't matter. I think it's important to live in alignment with our values to the extent that we can, and it goes without saying, the more privileged you are, the more responsibility you have. That means rejecting consumerism by buying less and boycotting industries like fast fashion and animal agriculture. It also means rejecting hustle culture once your needs are met. What that looked like for me was, even in my hustle era when I was prioritizing making and saving money for a house, I only worked 30 hours a week, excluding unpaid labor, to avoid burnout. Now that I'm financially secure and housed, I decided to cut my traditional work hours even further so I could focus on my dream job, which is advocating for degrowth with this YouTube channel. And to avoid burnout, because YouTube is a lot of work, I've chosen to upload every 10 to 14 days instead of every week. If that hinders my channel growth, so be it, because my nervous system cannot handle overwork. I could choose to keep working 30 hours a week in a sales job that is much more lucrative than YouTube, but then I would not be doing what I want with my time, which brings me more happiness than the money that a sales job would. I understand that most people are not in such a position to turn down money, but for those who are, I highly recommend it. Also, I'm keeping this an ad-free space, except for the default ads YouTube plays. So if you want to support this channel, you can sign up for my Patreon, where I raffle off pet portraits. Thank you so much for watching. Please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe so you can help me grow this channel, the good kind of growth. Alright, peace out.